Laura Knight sat on the cold bench outside the courtroom, clutching her trembling hands. The noise of her lawyer's phone vibrating against the wooden table didn't faze her. She was lost in the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. How had her life come to this? Just a year ago, she was a proud mother and a devoted wife to a man she believed was her partner in life. Now, she was stripped of her dignity, her home, and, most painfully, her son. The weight of betrayal was suffocating. Eric, her husband of 10 years and a man she had given everything to, had accused her of something unimaginable: infidelity. Not just in private, but in the glaring spotlight of the courtroom, where his wealth and influence turned every lie he told into a convincing truth. The judge didn't even hesitate when he handed full custody of their 8-year-old son, Daniel, to Eric, calling Laura unfit to be a parent. Unfit. The word echoed in her mind like a cruel mantra. She wanted to scream, to fight, to claw her way back to the life Eric had stolen from her. But how? He was Eric Knight, the multimillionaire CEO adored by the media, with a charm so convincing that even the judge seemed blinded by it. And Laura? She was now nothing more than a discarded wife, vilified by the same man she had loved and trusted with every fiber of her being. Laura's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Her lawyer, a small, wiry man with sharp eyes, poked his head out. "They're ready for you." She stood, her legs trembling but steady enough to walk. Today wasn't about winning back custody or reclaiming her innocence. No, today was about survival. She would face Eric again in that courtroom, but the real battle, the one that would restore her name, her son, and her life, was only beginning. But what Laura didn't know was that this fight wasn't just hers. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she held on to the faint hope that Daniel, her son, would one day see the truth. What she couldn't imagine was just how far Daniel would go to make things right, and how he would rise to become a force Eric could never control. As Laura stepped into the courtroom, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her. This was about showing Eric and the world that no amount of lies could bury the truth forever. The courtroom was suffocating, its air thick with tension and silent judgment. Laura sat stiffly in her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of the table in front of her. Across the room, Eric Knight lounged in his chair like a man who had already won. His tailored suit, the smug tilt of his chin, the occasional smirk that curled at the corner of his lips, it all screamed one thing: control. He had always been the master of control, in their marriage, in his business, and now in dismantling Laura's life. Laura had once admired that about him. When they first met, Eric's confidence had been magnetic. He was a self-made millionaire, a man who had built his empire from the ground up, and Laura was captivated by his drive. She believed in his vision, gave up her own career to support him, and eventually became the glue that held their family together. But Eric's need for control had twisted into something darker over the years. Now, as Eric's high-powered lawyer rattled off accusations, painting Laura as an unfaithful wife and an unstable mother, she realized just how deep that darkness ran. "Your Honor," the lawyer concluded, pacing dramatically across the courtroom, "the evidence speaks for itself. The surveillance footage shows Mrs. Knight entering a hotel room with another man late at night. The financial records indicate she was using Mr. Knight's money to fund private escapades. And the testimony from the nanny? Well, it's clear Mrs. Knight has neglected her responsibilities as a mother." Every word was a lie, meticulously crafted by Eric. Laura knew it, and deep down, Eric knew she knew it too. The so-called evidence was nothing more than Eric's wealth and influence turned into a weapon. The surveillance footage, edited. The financial records, manipulated. The nanny, paid off. But none of that mattered when Eric's lawyer presented it all with the polish of an expert storyteller. Laura's lawyer stood to respond, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, my client denies all allegations. The so-called evidence has inconsistencies we intend to investigate further. Mrs. Knight has been a devoted mother and wife, and this sudden character assassination raises more questions than answers." The judge, however, barely glanced at Laura's side of the argument. He was staring at the stack of documents Eric's team had presented, nodding along as if the decision had already been made. Eric leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile creeping across his face. The verdict came swiftly. The court ruled in Eric's favor, granting him full custody of Daniel. Laura was to vacate the family home immediately and was barred from contacting her son outside of scheduled supervised visits. The judge's words landed like punches to her chest. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Laura's world shattered. Outside the courthouse, Eric approached Laura, his smirk still firmly in place. His words were low, meant only for her ears. "You should have just played your part, Laura. You could have kept the house, seen Daniel whenever you wanted. But no, you had to fight back, and look where that got you." Laura clenched her fists, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You can't keep this up forever, Eric. The truth will come out." Eric chuckled. "Truth? The truth doesn't matter, Laura. Perception does. And right now, everyone perceives you as exactly what I made you out to be. A liar, a cheater, and an unfit mother." He walked away, leaving her standing there, humiliated and heartbroken. But in that moment, something inside Laura shifted. The devastation that had threatened to drown her gave way to a spark of determination. Eric might have won this round, but Laura wasn't going to let him destroy her. The days that followed were some of the darkest Laura had ever faced. She moved into a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city. Gone were the sprawling mansion, the designer clothes, and the comfortable life she had once known. In their place were second-hand furniture, a leaky faucet, and the relentless noise of traffic outside her window. Her new reality was harsh, but it wasn't without purpose. Laura threw herself into work, taking on 2 jobs, one as a waitress at a local diner and another as a receptionist at a small law office. Every dollar she earned went toward legal fees or saving for a better future. Every sleepless night was spent poring over the evidence Eric had presented, searching for cracks in his lies. But the hardest part wasn't the work or the exhaustion. It was the separation from Daniel. The scheduled visits were brief and coldly supervised, with Eric's lawyers ensuring Laura had no chance to speak freely to her son. She saw the confusion in Daniel's eyes, the questions he wasn't allowed to ask, and it broke her. Still, Laura held on to hope. She told herself that this wasn't the end of the story. Eric had underestimated her before, and he was doing it again. He thought she would crumble under the weight of his lies, but Laura wasn't going to crumble. She was going to fight. Late one night, while sifting through a box of documents, Laura found something she wasn't supposed to see, an overlooked email chain between Eric and his lawyer. The subject line read, "Asset Protection Plan." Her heart raced as she scanned the messages. The emails revealed more than just Eric's plans to secure custody of Daniel. They detailed how he had fabricated evidence against her, from forging the financial records to paying off the nanny for false testimony. This wasn't just a crack in Eric's lies, it was a gaping hole. For the first time in weeks, Laura felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She picked up the phone and dialed the one person she trusted, a lawyer she had worked with at the office, someone who had seen her resilience and believed in her innocence. "This fight isn't over," she said, her voice steady and determined. "I'm taking him back to court." Laura sat across from her new lawyer, Sam Harris, a sharp and compassionate attorney who had been quietly following her case. He had seen the media's portrayal of her, a disgraced wife accused of unthinkable acts, and never quite believed the story. When Laura called him late that night, desperation in her voice, Sam knew she wasn't lying. "This is it," Laura said, sliding the printouts of Eric's emails across the table. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was firm. "This is the proof I need to clear my name." Sam skimmed through the emails, his eyebrows arching higher with each page. "This is damning," he finally said, leaning back in his chair. "If these emails hold up in court, Eric's entire narrative falls apart. But Laura, this won't be easy. You're going up against one of the most powerful men in the city." "I don't care how powerful he is," Laura said, her jaw tightening. "He took my son. He destroyed my life. I'm not letting him get away with it." Sam nodded, admiration flickering in his eyes. "All right, we're going to fight this." Laura's days became a blur of work and preparation. Sam dove headfirst into the case, gathering everything they could use against Eric. Laura's role was just as critical. She combed through every scrap of her past life, looking for anything that could support her claims. Bank statements, text messages, photos, all of it was painstakingly organized and cataloged. One evening, while sifting through an old box of receipts, Laura stumbled upon a handwritten note from the nanny, tucked between grocery receipts. It read, "Mrs. Knight, I'm so sorry for what's happening. I didn't want to testify against you, but Mr. Knight left me no choice. Please forgive me." Laura's breath caught as she reread the note. It was an unexpected gift, a piece of Eric's manipulation exposed in the nanny's own words. When she showed the note to Sam the next day, he smiled for the first time in weeks. "This," he said, holding up the paper, "might be exactly what we need to get her to testify again. If we can turn her, Eric's entire case will collapse." Tracking down the nanny wasn't easy. She had left the city shortly after the trial, likely under Eric's orders, but Sam's network of contacts eventually found her. Laura approached her with a mix of hope and caution. When the nanny opened the door, her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously. "Mrs. Knight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I can't talk to you. Please leave." "Nina, wait," Laura said, holding up her hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I just want the truth." And the nanny hesitated, her gaze flickering to the note Laura held. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "Mr. Knight, he'll ruin me if I say anything." "He already ruined me," Laura replied, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I lost my home, my reputation, my son, because of his lies. Nina, I know he threatened you. I know he forced you to lie, but if you speak up now, you can help me get my life back. You can make this right." For a long moment, Nina didn't respond, but then, slowly, she nodded. "I'll testify," she whispered. "I can't keep living with this guilt." With the new evidence and Nina's agreement to testify, Sam filed a motion to reopen the custody case. The media caught wind of the development, and headlines exploded with the news. For the first time, Eric's pristine image began to crack. Rumors swirled about his tactics, his manipulation, and his desperation to maintain control. Eric, predictably, retaliated. He released carefully curated statements to the press, framing Laura's efforts as vindictive and claiming she was trying to damage his reputation out of spite. He even offered Laura a private settlement to drop the case, but she refused. "Your silence won't buy me, Eric," she told him during one of their court-mandated mediations. "Not now, not ever." The day of the hearing was a media frenzy. Cameras flashed as Laura walked into the courthouse, her head held high. Eric arrived minutes later, flanked by a team of high-profile lawyers, his confidence still intact despite the growing evidence against him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Laura's team presented their case with precision, starting with the emails that exposed Eric's plans to fabricate evidence. Next came Nina's testimony. Her voice shook as she described how Eric had coerced her into lying, but her words were clear and damning. Finally, Laura took the stand. She spoke about her marriage, the sacrifices she had made, and the pain of losing her son. But she didn't play the victim. Her words were full of quiet strength. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," she said, looking directly at Eric. "I'm here to reclaim my life, to show my son that the truth matters, that standing up for what's right is always worth it no matter the cost." As the court adjourned for the day, the judge's decision pending, Laura stepped outside into the bright sunlight. Reporters swarmed her, shouting questions, but she ignored them. Her focus was on the fight still ahead. Inside his car, Eric sat in silence, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. For the first time, he felt a sliver of doubt. His empire of lies was beginning to crumble, and Laura, the woman he had underestimated, was the one tearing it down. The battle wasn't over, But the tides had shifted, and Eric knew it. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that crackles with tension. All eyes were on the judge, who leaned forward, flipping through the final set of documents Laura's lawyer Sam had presented. Laura sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the aisle, Eric Knight maintained his usual air of arrogance, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood of the defense table. But the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed his confidence. He knew the walls were closing in. The judge looked up, adjusting his glasses. This court has reviewed the new evidence presented by Mrs. Knight and her legal team. The emails, financial documents, and witness testimonies paint a troubling picture of deliberate manipulation and falsehoods by Mr. Knight. Eric's jaw tightened. Laura allowed herself to exhale slightly, though her heart still raced. Furthermore, the judge continued, the testimony of Nina Carter confirms that the accusations against Mrs. Knight were not only fabricated, but were part of a calculated effort to destroy her credibility as a mother. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Eric's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge held up a hand to silence him. "Mr. Knight," he said firmly, "your actions have not only undermined the integrity of this court, but have caused significant harm to both Mrs. Knight and your son, Daniel. This court will not tolerate such abuse of power." Laura felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't cried in weeks, refusing to let herself break. But now, hearing those words, the dam she'd built within herself began to crack. The custody ruling is hereby reversed. Mrs. Knight is granted joint custody of Daniel, effective immediately. The gavel came down, sealing the verdict. Laura sat frozen, the weight of the moment washing over her. She had done it. Against all odds, she had reclaimed her place in her son's life. As the court adjourned, Eric stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyer trailing behind him. Laura followed at a distance, her lawyer by her side. She wasn't planning to confront Eric, but fate seemed to have other ideas. He turned sharply at the courthouse steps, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "This isn't over, Laura," he hissed, stepping closer to her. "You might have fooled the court, but don't think for a second you've won." Laura didn't flinch. For the first time in years, she looked him directly in the eye, her voice steady. "It's over when I say it's over, Eric, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." Eric's lips curled into a sneer, but he said nothing more. He turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Laura watched him go, knowing his threats weren't empty. Eric was the kind of man who couldn't stand to lose, and he would try to make her pay for this victory. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced his worst and come out stronger. Winning custody was only the first step. Rebuilding her relationship with Daniel would take time and patience. Their first unsupervised visit was both joyful and awkward. Daniel, now 9 years old, was old enough to sense the tension between his parents but too young to fully understand what had happened. As they sat on the floor of her modest apartment playing a board game, Daniel finally asked the question Laura had been dreading. "Mom," he said softly, not meeting her eyes, "why did Dad say those things about you? Were they true?" Laura set down her game piece, her heart aching at the confusion in his voice. "Daniel," she began, choosing her words carefully, "sometimes people say things that aren't true because they're scared of losing something. Your dad was scared, and he made a mistake, but the truth always comes out in the end." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his young face filled with both doubt and hope. "So, you didn't do anything bad?" "No, sweetheart," Laura said, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't." Daniel nodded, slowly, as if weighing her words. Then, to her relief, he leaned forward and hugged her tightly. "I believe you, Mom," he whispered. In that moment, Laura felt like she could breathe again. Over the next few years, Daniel began to see his father's true colors. Eric's charm faded as his controlling nature became more evident. He criticized Daniel relentlessly, pushing him to excel in ways that felt more like demands than encouragement. The contrast between his parents couldn't have been clearer. His father, with his sharp words and cold demeanor, and his mother, who encouraged him with quiet strength and unwavering love. By the time Daniel turned 16, he had made up his mind. He no longer wanted to live under Eric's roof. He told Laura during one of their long walks in the park. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but resolute, "I want to move in with you. Dad, he doesn't care about me. Not really. He just wants to control me." Laura stopped walking, her heart swelling with both pride and sadness. "Are you sure, Daniel? This isn't a decision to take lightly." "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I know where I belong." As Daniel grew older, his resentment toward Eric deepened. It wasn't just about the lies Eric had told about Laura, it was about everything Eric represented. His wealth, built on manipulation and greed, stood in stark contrast to the values Laura had instilled in him: honesty, integrity, and resilience. By the time Daniel entered college, he had developed a plan. He didn't share it with Laura, knowing she would disapprove. She had always told him that revenge wasn't the answer, that building something meaningful was more important than tearing something down. But Daniel couldn't shake the desire to hold Eric accountable. He decided he would do it in a way that Eric would never see coming. He wouldn't just confront his father, he would outsmart him. And the first step was building a fortune of his own. As he worked tirelessly on his tech startup, Daniel kept one thought in mind. "This isn't just for me, it's for Mom. It's for justice." Daniel's journey to independence began with the fire lit inside him during his teenage years. Watching his mother endure hardship and emerge victorious taught him resilience. Witnessing his father's lies and manipulation inspired a different kind of resolve, a drive to not only succeed, but to one day confront Eric on equal footing. By the time Daniel entered college, he had already begun laying the foundation for his future. He was a brilliant student, naturally gifted in technology and innovation, but it was his discipline and focus that set him apart. While his peers spent their evenings at parties, Daniel spent his nights coding, brainstorming, and developing ideas for his own tech startup. In his sophomore year, Daniel launched his first app, a platform that connected small businesses with freelancers. It wasn't flashy, but it filled a need in the market, and within a year, it had grown far beyond his expectations. Investors began taking notice, and by the time he graduated, Daniel had secured funding to expand his venture. At his graduation ceremony, Laura sat proudly in the audience, her heart swelling with pride. Daniel, now a confident young man, stood at the podium delivering a speech as valedictorian. His words reflected the lessons he had learned from her. Success isn't about what you gain. It's about what you overcome to get there. After the ceremony, Daniel pulled Laura aside, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Mom, I've been waiting to tell you something," he said, handing her a business card with his company's name and logo on it. Laura blinked back tears as she read it. "You built this?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. "With your example as my foundation," he said. "You showed me what it means to fight for what matters." While Daniel's star was rising, Eric's empire was beginning to crumble. Years of questionable business practices and reckless investments had started to catch up with him. Scandals began to surface. Reports of mistreated employees, lawsuits from former partners, and whispers of financial instability. The media, once charmed by Eric's charisma, now turned on him, scrutinizing his every move. Eric, however, refused to acknowledge the cracks in his empire. He continued living lavishly, throwing extravagant parties and making risky deals to maintain the illusion of success. But behind the scenes, he was scrambling to keep his company afloat. By the time Daniel turned 25, he was one of the youngest millionaires in the tech industry. His startup had grown into a thriving enterprise, and his name was becoming synonymous with innovation. But while his success brought him personal satisfaction, there was one goal he hadn't yet achieved. For years, Daniel had quietly tracked Eric's business dealings, studying his weaknesses and vulnerabilities. He knew that Eric's company was on the brink of collapse, and he saw an opportunity, not just to confront his father, but to take back what had been stolen from his mother. Using a proxy investor, Daniel began buying shares of Eric's company. At first, the transactions went unnoticed, buried in the chaos of Eric's failing finances. But as Daniel's stake grew, it became clear that someone was consolidating power. The boardroom was silent as Eric entered, flanked by his remaining allies. He had called an emergency meeting, expecting to meet a group of potential investors who could save his company. Instead, he found Daniel sitting at the head of the table. For a moment, Eric froze, his usual arrogance faltering. "Daniel," he said, forcing a smile, "what are you doing here?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but unyielding. "I'm here because this company is no longer yours," he said evenly. "As of this morning, I'm the majority shareholder." Eric's face twisted with disbelief. "You? This is a joke." "It's no joke," Daniel said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "You made a career out of controlling people, Dad, but control is a fragile thing. All it takes is the right pressure to make it fall apart." Eric scanned the documents, his hands trembling as the reality sank in. His own son had outmaneuvered him, using the same strategies Eric had once used to manipulate others. "This is betrayal," Eric hissed, his voice low and venomous. "No," Daniel said, his voice steady. "This is justice. You tried to destroy Mom and you nearly succeeded. But she showed me what strength looks like. She taught me that the truth always wins, even when it takes time." Eric slumped into his chair, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his defeat. He had spent his life building an empire, only to lose it to the very person he had underestimated the most. The news of Daniel's takeover spread quickly. Headlines declared him a visionary, a young entrepreneur who had saved a failing company from ruin. But the real story, the one about Eric's downfall, was just beginning to circulate. At a press conference announcing the transition, Daniel stood in front of a room full of reporters. Laura stood quietly in the back, her presence unnoticed but deeply felt by Daniel. When asked about his decision to take over his father's company, Daniel replied simply, "This isn't about revenge, it's about rebuilding. My goal is to create something meaningful, something built on integrity, not manipulation." As the cameras flashed, Eric watched from the shadows, his once brilliant reputation now in tatters. For the first time in his life, he had no control, and it was his own son who had taken it from him. Eric's humiliation was complete. His company, the empire he had built on lies and manipulation, was no longer his. Daniel's calculated takeover had stripped him of his power and influence, leaving him nothing but the weight of his failures. For days, the media feasted on the story, detailing every scandal that had come to light during the transition. But for Daniel, this wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a turning point, a chance to steer his life and the company in a direction his mother would be proud of. His focus wasn't on destroying Eric. It was on rebuilding what Eric had broken. The evening after the takeover, Daniel returned to Laura's modest home. She had refused to move into the luxury apartments he had offered, preferring the quiet, humble space she had built for herself. When Daniel walked through the door, she was in the kitchen preparing tea. She looked up and smiled, though her expression held a mix of pride and concern. "It's done," Daniel said, setting his briefcase down. "The company is ours." "Ours?" Laura asked, arching an eyebrow as she poured the tea. Daniel nodded. "I didn't just take it to prove a point. I want to fix what he broke. I want to make it something good, something real. And I want you to be part of it." Laura set the teapot down and crossed the room to face her son. "Daniel," she said softly, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished. But are you sure this is what you want? Revenge and rebuilding aren't the same thing." "This isn't revenge, Mom," Daniel said, his voice steady. "This is me making sure his legacy doesn't define us. You fought for the truth, and now it's my turn to make sure that truth builds something better." Laura studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's do it. Together." In the months that followed, Daniel rebranded the company, renaming it Knight Enterprises as a nod to his family's resilience. He implemented sweeping changes, introducing ethical business practices and a renewed focus on social responsibility. Laura became a key advisor, her insight and compassion shaping the company's new mission. One of Daniel's first major projects was establishing the Laura Knight Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting single parents and victims of false accusations. At its launch event, Daniel delivered a heartfelt speech that left the audience moved. "My mother taught me that strength isn't about power or control," he said, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "It's about resilience. It's about standing up when the world tries to knock you down. This foundation is a testament to her strength and to everyone who's ever been told they aren't enough. You are enough, and together we can prove it." Meanwhile, Eric retreated into obscurity. His public disgrace had left him isolated, abandoned by the same people who once praised him. He sold off what little personal assets he had left, moving into a modest apartment far from the spotlight. Occasionally, he would see headlines about Daniel's success and the company's new direction. Each one was a reminder of what he had lost, not just his fortune, but his son's respect. One day, Eric received a letter in the mail. The return address was Daniel's office, and inside was a simple, handwritten note. "Dad, you once told Mom that the truth doesn't matter. You were wrong." Eric stared at the note for a long time, his hands trembling. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices, but by then, it was too late to undo the damage he had done. For Laura, life finally felt whole again. She had gone from being a woman stripped of everything to a mother standing beside her son as he built a legacy rooted in truth and integrity. She often thought back to those dark days when Eric's lies had nearly destroyed her, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what she had learned about herself. One evening, as she sat on the porch of her home, Daniel joined her, holding 2 cups of tea. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Mom," Daniel said after a while, "do you think he regrets it?" Laura didn't need to ask who he meant. She took a sip of her tea, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Regret doesn't change the past," she said softly. "But what we do with our future, that's what matters." The story ends at a celebratory event marking the first anniversary of the Laura Knight Foundation. The hall is filled with families whose lives have been changed by the foundation's work. As Daniel stands at the podium, Laura watches from the audience, her heart full. Daniel speaks with the same conviction that has driven him since the beginning. "This foundation isn't just about helping others," he says. "It's about showing that no matter how broken life may seem, there's always a way to rebuild." The crowd erupts into applause as Laura wipes away a tear. In that moment, she knows they've done more than reclaim their lives. They've built a legacy of strength, resilience, and justice that will endure far beyond them.